Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Everything Cookbooks. 2 years ago, Andrea and Kristin, Kate Leahy, Kristin Donnelly, and I launched this podcast to take listeners behind the scenes of the cookbook creation process. The idea grew out of our own experiences navigating cookbook publishing in a kind of learn-as-you-go kind of way. And we really wanted to make the process more transparent to aspiring authors and cookbook fans in general. Truth is, we also really love geeking out about how books get made, and this podcast is a great excuse for us to talk to each other and to interview fellow authors, agents, editors, photographers, marketers, booksellers, and so many other professionals in the business. We often say we're making the podcast that we wished we could have listened to when we started our careers. And I'll admit that when we started the show, we weren't entirely sure who, if anyone, would tune in, or if we'd run out of things to talk about. But we have been thrilled with the response the show gets, and we never seem to run out of things to say or questions to ask. So much so that we've now recorded 4 full seasons of Everything Cookbooks and over 80 episodes. And we are very busy working on our 5th season. We launched the podcast back on March 9th in 2022. And so to mark our 2nd anniversary, we're reissuing our inaugural episode with the fitting subject of, should you write a cookbook? We think the conversation still holds up. We hope you do too. Thanks for listening.
Does every cookbook really need to be written? I don't know. There's some cookbooks where you look at, you're like, how did that get made? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks. This is the podcast that lets you get behind the scenes of the cookbook creation process. We're hosted by Andrea and Kristin, Molly Stevens, Kristin Donnelly, and me, Kate Leahy. With this first episode, we're going to ask the essential question that any would-be author needs to ask themselves. And that is, should you actually write a cookbook? Is a cookbook the right way to tell your story and share your recipes? Let's get into it. So with the first episode that we're doing in this podcast series, we are going to go with the essential question that anyone wanting to write a cookbook needs to ask. Should you write a cookbook? It's one of those things where I think it helps to know a little bit about my co-hosts and how they came into the cookbook publishing space. I'll start with Molly Stevens. I mean, what was it like to get your first cookbook deal? What kind of drove you to want to write a cookbook?
What it was like, thanks, Kate, it was terrifying. It was terrifying because I loved cookbooks so much. I revered them and thought of them as something, I don't know, bigger than something that I could do. I was just starting out as a freelancer, and I got an opportunity through a project I worked on. I think my real reason for going for it, for jumping off that cliff is what it felt like, was I saw it as a way to, I had been a culinary educator, chef instructor at culinary colleges for a while, and I saw it as a way to combine teaching and my love of writing. And so that was what sort of hooked me into saying yes to the project, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. Congratulations for just jumping in there, even though you were scared that it was bigger than life. But what was it about it feeling bigger than life? I mean, I think all of us here have that feeling of like before you're published, you're thinking, ordinary people don't get published.
Right.
It's like these mythical beasts that get published somehow. So
yeah, no, exactly. And it was a point in my career, in my life, where I was saying yes to things that seemed harder than, I'd say yes and then hang up the phone and be like, oh my God, what did I just say yes to kind of thing. And so I was in that space career-wise. So it felt like the leap to take.
That's amazing.
Molly, tell us actually, what was that first book?
Well, the book I'm referring to, and actually, technically, it's not the first book with my name on the cover, but it's all about braising. A book about braising, of all things. And it came out in 2004. The editor was Maria Guarnaschelli at Norton, and she was taking a big risk on me because I was an unknown. And so I just stepped up and swung, really. It took me 5 years to do it, though.
Did Maria approach you to write that book?
Maria did. I had worked with her. Oh, gosh. I had worked with her on The Joy of Cooking that massive 1997 Joy of Cooking project. So that was how I got involved. And then I developed a relationship. So I really want to hear your stories because I think relationships are going to come into this too.
Right. I mean, Andrea, how did you become a published cookbook author? What was your first break?
I had to knock on a lot of doors. I am a refugee immigrant, a math head. I struggled with writing when I was growing up because English isn't my first language. But I loved cookbooks. And that's how I learned about what America is, frankly, watching sitcoms and reading cookbooks. And I thought, well, there needs to be a Vietnamese cookbook out there that reflects the experience of Vietnamese people in America, Vietnamese Americans. I didn't see that. And I thought, why not? I can write a cookbook. But what I realized and what agents told me was that it's a great idea, kid, but you're not on television. We can't represent you. So I was rejected. I wasn't invited to do anything really until I bizarrely met the owner of a small press called 10 Speed Press based in Berkeley. And I had by then collected so many cookbooks that I knew what 10 Speed was. They were a press interested in Asian titles and Asian subjects. And they took it on and gave me every single resource possible to make that first cookbook into the Vietnamese kitchen realizable and beautiful. But, before that, I couldn't get a real job. I couldn't get arrested practically in Santa Cruz where I lived. I was like, freelancing, doing communication consulting work. What I did was I started building a website called Viet World Kitchen because I thought I would just share my information there as a culinary hub dedicated to Asian food and particularly Vietnamese food. 10 Speed Press came along and offered me, what I would consider to be like the first record contract, the first book deal. And I never thought I could write more cookbooks beyond that because I felt like my dream from when I was, 10 or 12 years old had been realized and that was it. But I guess I was wrong.
Playing the long game. What about you, Kristin? What was your first cookbook?
My first cookbook was Modern Potluck, and it was published in 2016. So I have not been on the scene nearly as long as the rest of you, and I'm always honored to spend time with you. I guess I had a fairly traditional approach where I had an agent and worked with my agent on a proposal, and then we shopped the proposal around to publishers. I was an editor at Food and Wine magazine for many years, but I've never built my own big following. So that was a challenge. But I think because the book had an idea that hadn't been done in a while, it was kind of time, I thought, for a fresh take on potluck food. And Clarkson Potter ended up publishing it because they agreed. So that's the story. And now I actually mostly write books with other people or collaborate with other people rather than creating my own. But who knows what will come.
That's true. And I got into cookbook writing as well through collaborations. Collaborations are great ways to get your cookbook writing chops while you're helping other people tell their stories. And that's definitely my story. My first book was A16 Food and Wine, and it came out in 2008. So a long time ago, but you have to look in the fine print for my name. So it was my idea. I approached the restaurant. I had worked there as a line cook, and I thought, it just seemed like the type of restaurant that had a great story to tell in a cookbook format. I did the same track. I was lucky, like Andrea, to know this little small publishing company called 10 Speed Press. And I just cold called them essentially. And that's how we got the book deal. Now, for those of you who don't know, 10 Speed is no longer this tiny little publishing house. It is actually part of Penguin Random House, which is a very, very large, I think the largest in the world publisher. So things are a little different now. But on that note, I thought we should dig into our episode. So should you write a cookbook? We all thought yes, back in the day when we embarked on our first cookbook. But, it's not always the most obvious step. And it's also not always the right first step for people who want to do food content. So I want to throw it to Andrea. Why should somebody write a cookbook? What are some really good reasons?
When I think about it, I think you should write a cookbook because you got something to say. You got something to contribute. This week, I recently got this strange email pitch from a PR person working with a publishing house. And the person was helping out a celebrity put together a chili book, 100 chili recipes from around the globe. And they were like looking for more contributions from, regular people like me and perhaps chefs that I knew. And they wanted to know if I wanted to pitch ideas. And I thought, I don't know if that book should exist, and that really got me thinking, like, if you can't put together a book on your own, if you don't have something to say that can really help people improve their lives or just open up understanding about something, you may not have that mojo, but you may want to contribute something to say your community, your club. So it could be small or it could be large, but you got to have something to say.
I'm thinking the first step here is to have recipes, because it seems that pitch they were looking, it was a call for recipes. It would be like, okay, I want to publish a novel. Here's a call for ideas for my novel. That's not how it works, right?
Right.
So you actually need recipes. I mean, Molly, what do you think? If I'm coming to you and I say, hey, I really have this great idea. I want to do a cookbook about koji fermented ice cream because this is the new craze. I mean, should I do it?
When we started talking about this podcast, I think one of the reasons that I thought it was such a great idea is because if I had a nickel for how many people have over the years said, I want to write a cookbook, can you have coffee with me or get on the phone with me or talk to me about my cookbook idea, I'd have a lot of nickels. And it's very interesting because my first immediate answer, should you write a cookbook, is sure. But what are you trying to say? What Andrea said, do you have something to say? Do you have something to contribute? And who are you writing it for? If you're writing a cookbook, if you have this incredible family history of a certain type of food or just food that you love or food that brings your people together, and you want to record that for posterity or to share with the rest of your family, community, great. But if you think that cookbook is going to necessarily sell on an open market, that's a different question. So I think it's really important to figure out why you're writing the cookbook, along with should you write the cookbook. I think we've all sort of talked about our process and everybody's made it clear it's a lot of work. So that decision of whether you should do it is one that I think is, it merits a lot of thought, because you don't want to start into it and realize it's too much work or it's not worth the effort.
Right. I mean, for Kristin, when you're working with people, what are the types of things that you talk to them about when you're trying to figure out if this is the right collaboration? You think they have a story to tell, you check that box. They have recipes, or maybe they have recipes in the works, you check that box. But what are some of the other factors that go into whether this is a cookbook project versus a blog versus a video series versus a Patreon site? What's important?
Well, cookbooks are a tangible object as opposed to a website. So it has to be worth putting into this tangible object. So I do think about, do they have something to say? And will it stand the test of time? I mean, that's not to say you can't do a book that hits on a trend, but I do like to try to work on books that will have some life. So in 10 years, somebody might pick it up and still find something valuable in there. One thing I also consider is I'm not against somebody writing a cookbook to build their brand or to expand their brand, but I think it shouldn't be the only reason for somebody to do it. Again, what do they want to say?
Right. I think what you're saying too is that when you have a physical object, it's published, you can't go back and edit it. The pages are printed. So that edition is going to stay how it is. You can't cross off things. You can't change ingredients. It's going to stand because it's a physical object. So if you're somebody who works more in digital media and you like that idea of going back and changing recipes or going back and adding other content, and maybe you just want to hit on something that is happening this month or next month, you have to think for a cookbook. You're thinking, 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road? We're playing the long game here, ladies. I mean, when you're getting into cookbooks, I mean, you're not going in to make a lot of money in that first year. You're hoping your book stays in print and has that long life that maybe every 6 months you get the nice little royalty check in the mail for the long term. But we can go into more about publishing nitty gritty and what a royalty check is in a later podcast. But just thinking about playing the long game. I mean, Andrea, your first book was 2006, I believe. And since then, how many books have you come out with?
Oh my God. I think I've written 6 and I edited edited another, so 7 altogether. But, I was thinking about like ultimate goals and who the reader is for your cookbook. I say to people, if you want to write a cookbook, first outline it, but also think about the proposal. And you don't have to write like a long-winded proposal, just even what I call a proposalette. 2 pages, for example. Why? Who it is that you're envisioning will use your book. How long will the book be? How do you envision this publication? And the other day I was reading something about dictionaries of all things, like versus using Wikipedia or something online. And so this goes back to your question, Kate, of, the difference between print and a website. So the author, and this was an essay in the New York Times Magazine, the author said, opening up a dictionary or a book is like opening an oyster. Going online is like going down a rabbit hole. So you can decide if print is this oyster, a book is an oyster, and it has this beautiful thing that you open up and you are amazed by, this pearlescence. Whereas something that is online and virtual, it also leads you on journeys that you never know where you're going to end up at. And those are 2 different experiences. And I think that to keep in mind that, books are these oysters, that these these things that you open up and they're precious. That is part of what drives me when I put a book idea together. It's like, what can I give to my readers that's really going to be special and something that will contribute to their being better cooks or having healthier lives? I don't know. That mojo, having something to say is something that obviously is important to all 4 of us.
I love that. Like just the idea of contributing to somebody's life. What are you contributing to somebody's life?
It's interesting because you talk about like your first book and Kristin, you talk about your first book with Modern Potluck, and Kate, your A16, where it was, your name is in fine print somewhere in it. But we've all made a career out of writing cookbooks or working on cookbooks. And yet that first book, I didn't necessarily have any idea that this would become a career. I mean, certainly I hoped it would succeed and that it would lead to something else. But that notion that one book was going to be enough for now, that was where all my focus was. I wasn't getting a 5-book deal or trying to, I wasn't launching into and not that there's anything wrong with saying I'm going to write this book and then this book and then this book. But this notion, I think it's just very interesting to see how the singular books exist within a larger career. And we talked about different ways to publish, but I also think that a cookbook, I'm doing air quotes on career because it's really just a piece of a larger puzzle. I'm a cookbook author, and that's probably the first thing that will come after, my name if I'm describing what I do for a living. But it's just one piece of a very complicated puzzle that is a freelance life, really, or a freelance professional livelihood. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about platforms, actually. Kristin, what do you think a platform is today?
I mean, it's funny because when I talk to people who want to write cookbooks or are working on a proposal, they always ask me about Instagram followers because agents use an Instagram following often to decide on whether or not to sign somebody. And sometimes publishers look at that as well. And so I think sometimes we think of platform very narrowly as like your Instagram following. I feel like Andrea has done this amazing job where she has such a devoted following and she has a wide platform, an active email list, very active blog. I mean, I think you post once a week, which to me is amazing. And it just shows it doesn't necessarily have to be huge if it's deep. And to me, she's a great example of somebody who has a very deep following or deep platform. So I think it can mean a lot of things. And obviously, platform can be way more than just Instagram, many other social platforms and TV, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, Andrea, for you, did you always know that was an important thing that you had to do to keep your name out there? Just did it just come naturally to you as you were building your website when you first got started?
I had very little platform when Into the Vietnamese Kitchen published in 2006. And I had this website and, it feels like a whole other lifetime back in the early 2000s, right? Before social media exploded the way it did. Viet World Kitchen was a website that I built from code. It wasn't a blog format. And so by the time the book came out, I didn't know what was happening, I mean, it was just the normal PR channels and there was a lot of recognition, positive recognition for the book, it was bloggers like Heidi Swanson, who publishes 101cookbooks.com, who wrote to me and said, you need to start a blog. You need to switch that website to a blog format. And I was like, why? And she goes, because Heidi was just like, just do it. And there were other Asian bloggers who were just like, yeah, do it. And then they said, and get on Twitter. So I got this sort of unsolicited advice from people who had seen my work on Viet Wo Kitchen, and they were like, hey, and she said, I've got a book. And they were really helping me, giving me the tools, because I am such like the geek. I would read cookbooks for all day long if I could, rather than do social media. But over time, I realized, and of course, it's like 15 years now, right? That social media is also a fabulous, fabulous way for authors to learn and to engage with real cooks. So there are benefits to it. But back then, I didn't know what I was doing. And I was really like muddling through what social media was. And I didn't even fully understand Twitter, and I still don't. But I think of social media and developing a platform because, frankly, you got to hustle, And I think we've all hustled to like write our books and put them together. But the hustle is where the sales is coming from. And having a platform is part of that. So you don't need to have a huge platform like Kristin says. But Molly, you've written all about braising as a substantive, awesome doorstop of a book that, people return to over and over. It's a cult classic. So, that platform, I don't know.
And that hustle, I think, is something that we'll talk about in another, that post-production hustle, because there's a lot of hustle involved, but that how you sell a book, like how you sell a book to a publisher, if you're using traditional publishing, is definitely something we'll talk about. But then once you've written the book, I remember the first time around, I thought I was done, clap my hands. My work is done, and suddenly you have to sell the book. And I think that is an important thing to think about if you're going a traditional model before you start to write it, because that's a lot of work to sell that book. And that's putting yourself, if you're an author, which many of us tend to be introverted to begin with, and you would rather just sit home and read other people's books, and then someone tells you have to get out there and start to tell people to buy your book. That's a really tough transition, and just one you need to brace yourself for, or hire a lot of help if you can afford it.
Right. I mean, nowadays, a traditional publisher is going to pick authors who they think can support the sales efforts. They're not going to take a chance, especially if you're an unknown author and you're not somebody that someone can find online. You don't have a website. Publishers are going to probably shy away from you just because the whole idea of being somebody in the public domain is so much more important now than it probably was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It was important then, but now it's just incredibly important. People want to know who's behind their books. And this is across all publishing, not just cookbooks. But fortunately for us, we get to talk to people about food. We're not talking to people about topics that might be, just harder to get excited about in a social media atmosphere. I mean, I think talking about food can be a way to connect with such a broad range of people from all over and all over the world, really. So I think that's the fun side. Everyone knows social media is not always fun, but it does have this way of generating communities that you wouldn't have found otherwise. So we can look at the silver lining. But one of the things I think social media does do is that if you're out there, you really want to publish a cookbook or work on cookbooks, but you're not involved in cookbooks right now. Maybe your day job, maybe you're a lawyer, maybe you're a teacher, maybe you're a student, and you're wondering, well, these people are talking about their amazing cookbook lives, but how do I even get like a little peek behind the curtain? Well, I think maybe social media is one of those ways. I mean, starting conversations. If, say, Molly, if I were in cooking school right now and I started cooking through all about braising and tagging you in each photo every time I'm making one of your recipes, wouldn't you want to know who I was?
Yeah, of course. And you see this, I see this all the time on Andrea's feeds and all of your feeds. And someone unknown will have cooked something and you reply, and a dialogue can start through that too. It's incredible the people that you find. I used to travel and teach a lot of cooking classes, and I have people I'm still in touch with because they approached me after a class, and that's sort of, not social media, but it's the same thing. It's making connections through the food and through the recipes. I think Modern Potluck, when it came out, Kristin, weren't they having potlucks? And you did a really cool thing with that.
Yeah, when I wrote the book, I tried to make the book somewhat of a potluck itself. I mean, most of the recipes were my own, but I had 10 recipes or so from other people, many of them with larger platforms. But then I can't remember if I named an exact day and we did like a big potluck. I did use social media a lot to promote Modern Potluck. And almost, I hate the word leverage, but I guess it's sort of like leverage other people's platforms that were larger than mine to help promote it as well and promote the idea of potlucks.
Which is such a great idea now. We should revisit the whole Modern Potluck promotion that you did then and just recreate it now, because I mean, especially after 2020 and the year that 2021 and what 2022 will bring, getting together and sharing food has never really been more important. So we've talked a bit about our backgrounds, a bit about whether people should write a cookbook, what it takes to write a cookbook. But what if, say, I just want to get my foot in the door in the cookbook world by helping somebody write a book? Like maybe, Andrea, I'm somebody who maybe is a lawyer by day, but I wanted to learn a little bit more about the cookbook process. Can I help you? I'm sure you get questions like that. What do you tell people?
I have volunteer recipe testers that I've used for all of my books because, frankly, I can't afford to pay someone professionally. But on top of that, I love the feedback that non-professional home cooks can give me using a regular stove. And these are all super smart people who edit my work. They point out my foibles. Frankly, they kick my butt every single time, and they kick it hard. And they're shopping at regular markets, and they'll go to Asian markets, they'll shop online, and they make mistakes, And so for me, they're all getting, to work behind the scenes with me on a book, and it truly is a collaboration. So even if you feel you don't have the mojo to write a full book, you can still take part in testing a book. I also do things like I recently sent a survey out to my following and asked them to give input on my new book idea. And so I thought, I'm just going to get like a few responses, but there were over 1,500 people who responded because I asked them for for their opinion. And so this is part of the beauty of reaching out and asking for help. We don't work in a vacuum anymore. I think back in the early 2000s when I was much younger and, writing in the silo of my home kitchen, I didn't really have to think about what other people may do with the food necessarily. But now I do. And it's really kind of a wonderful thing because I feel like I'm even better at writing recipes for other people, even though at the end of the line, I need to be satisfied with the flavors for myself. But there are many ways that you can write a book, whether it's traditional publishing with a house, a publisher, or self-publishing. It's just opened up so much over the years.
I so agree. And I also think that studying cookbooks, I think we've all shared a love of cookbooks before we started writing our own. I think that's kind of I would say a necessary ingredient or certainly helpful, but studying cookbooks. And when we go forward in this podcast, I think we'll talk about the various elements because, a cookbook is not just a collection of recipes. Obviously, you need the recipes and you need to have, something, but there are headnotes and there are sidebars and there are backstories. And so as I would say, go to your library if you don't have an extensive cookbook library or browse at a bookstore and start to identify for yourself, what are the elements of this cookbook? And then which ones do you think appeal to you want to write or work on? And maybe it's not the recipes, but you love the headnotes, you love the texture of the prose, you love this idea of weaving a fabric of a book together. Maybe there's a chef in your town or a home cook or someone whose food you just think is incredible and people need to know about it. Maybe you approach that person, and Kristin or Kate with your co-author experience. I think you can, going forward in future episodes, we could talk about how you create a collaborative effort. It's like you could say, hey, I'm a great writer. I think your food is amazing. I think the world needs to know about your food, or maybe our town needs to know about your food, or whatever, however big you want to draw that circle. And then that's a way to start something. So it could be ghostwriting, which means your name is in fine print, or it's co-writing, which your name is in a little bit bigger print, or co-authoring, which, there's all these different levels of that collaboration. But that notion that there are so many different elements, or maybe, and this is not our areas of expertise as much, but there's all the photographs and the illustrations. And if that's the element you love, there's a way in there. Are you an incredible food photographer, or do you just love props? You've been collecting. You could be a prop stylist. Do people even know there's such a thing as a prop stylist? And that's a big part of putting together a cookbook. So there's so many elements to it, and we'll touch on a lot of those. Certainly, the writing is what we know the most about.
Right. And one of those things that I wanted to touch on just really briefly here is we've been talking about traditional publishing, but indie publishing, also called self-publishing, also called probably other things, hybrid publishing, is definitely something that used to be more frowned on than it is now. And now there's so much more interest and energy being put into that space. That can be a really effective way, creating a cookbook. If you like the hustle and you like figuring out all the nuts and bolts that go with marketing and producing, basically becoming a producer and a writer, self-publishing can be a great way to get a book to the world faster without having to go through the traditional channels. And this can be especially effective. Say you are a food entrepreneur and you have a product that you want people to know about in the next year. You don't want to take 2 years to make a published book through a Penguin Random House type imprint. You want a book now that you can start sharing with your customers. So self-publishing is something we will have more information on. But if you don't subscribe, janefriedman.com is a great resource for a lot of self-publishing information. And we can put that in the show notes. We've done this roundup of a lot of little bits and pieces about what's in the cookbook world. And I wanted to just conclude by saying, is a cookbook right for you? And I'm going to do a speed roundup. Is a cookbook right for you? And I'm going to ask all three of you a question on what somebody should ask if a cookbook is right for you. Kristin, I'm going to start with you. What's the first thing you should ask?
Are you ready to do a lot of work?
Ooh.
Honestly, you're talking about self-publishing, and whether you self-publish or you work through a publisher, it is so much work unless you are hiring people to do everything for you, which some celebrities do that. They might not always admit to it, but they hire a writer, they hire a recipe developer, a recipe tester, photographer, the whole thing. But then those people do a lot of work. To create a good book, no matter how it's done, it's just a lot of work. So that's what I would say. Are you ready to do a lot of work?
I love it. That's a really important question. Molly, what is your question that someone should ask?
Oh boy, there are a lot of them, but we've covered a lot. Like, do you have something to say? But what is going to set your book apart? What is going to make your book a unique contribution? And then a sidebar is on the recipe development. Do you have the wherewithal to cook the same thing over and over and over and over again until you get it right?
And budget for it.
Yeah. And budget for it, or have people to eat it, or a place to, share it, because there's a lot of food that goes into writing a cookbook.
So true, Molly. Yeah, because I had a baking book idea, and then I literally was like, I don't want to eat the food.
I talked about writing a book on frying, and I totally could see the book. I could see the whole, do you have a vision for the book? I think is a really, Andrea touched on this. Could you see the start and the finish of this book? And I could see this book on frying, but I just I'm not going to fry food for 2 years. I'm just not doing it. I don't want to eat all that. Sorry. I love fried food.
I have fried an entire chapter of dumplings, and my laptop went bonkers and died.
I did the entire fried chapter for the potato cookbook, and I lived through that, but an entire book from start to finish, I couldn't do it.
Oh man. And then you have to clean, and no one ever thinks of how much time it takes to clean your kitchen, especially after doing a lot of frying. So Andrea, what is your burning question?
Man, you guys took all my answers. Who is going to be cooking from your book over and over? Who do you want to revisit your book? Who do you want to have your book in their kitchen?
Yeah.
Who is that person?
I love that. I love that question because it also makes me think of something you said earlier about you have real people cooking your recipes, and they'll tell you that it's annoying to call for 10 ounces of something if the package is 14 ounces. And what am I going to do with the extra 4 ounces? You'll find that information out.
I do. Yeah. I have a mother too, an 87-year-old mother who said to me one day, what are scallions? I see it in your recipes all the time, scallions. And I said, they're green onions. And she said, they're not marked that way at the grocery store.
Oh, snap.
Yeah.
Wow. I have to check my grocery store. I don't think I've ever noticed.
I'm going to have to also. Yeah.
How about you, Kate?
Okay. So yeah, I had the question and now it's turned on me, and this is unfortunate because I'm at the end. And of course, everyone had such great answers. So I'm just going to go, this one's going to be a little wonky. I would say if you think you have this burning, great, awesome idea for a cookbook, go to a library, go to a bookstore, go online and see what other cookbooks are in that category, because you might be surprised that there are cookbooks that are very similar to what you're proposing. And that's not to say that your idea isn't feasible, but you need to know that those books are out there so then you can really tailor your idea to be original in itself. So I think it's one of those things where I used to think that if there were a lot of cookbooks on the same topic, that you shouldn't go into that. But then again, there's a lot of Starbucks on the same street, and then they keep opening more Starbucks on the same street. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if there's a lot of cookbooks on that topic, but you just want to make sure that your cookbook stands apart. That's what I would say for our lightning round, which was not so lightning, but it was short and sweet. So on that note, tip of the week, where we talk about something we learned about recipe development or cooking or writing that we thought was really handy. So Molly, do you have one for us this week?
This is something I found in the back pages of a book called Taste and Technique by Naomi Pomeroy, the chef out of Portland, Oregon. Often recipes will say slice something 1/4 inch or roll out a pie dough 1/8 of an inch. And I know you all have rulers in your kitchen because you're recipe developers, and you do, but not everyone has a ruler in their utensil drawer. So you take a stack of 4 quarters, and she just keeps a stack of 4 quarters in her kitchen. 4 quarters stacked up equals 1/4 of an inch.
Oh,
yeah.
So cool.
So it was just such a nifty little real world, like to know how to measure on your, various things without having to pull out a ruler.
That is so cool. How did you stumble upon that? Was it way in the back of the book, or?
Way in the back of the book, where I think that's some of the true gems in books are in their addendums and in their, equipment lists and things like that, just tucked away. And she just had a bunch of little sort of helpful hints. And I was actually reviewing the book for Susan Chang did a podcast for a little while about cookbooks. It was super fun. And she would give cookbooks and you'd review them together. And so I cooked my way through this Taste and Technique book. It's a really interesting book. It's talk about a doorstop, but came out a few years ago. But yeah, 4 quarters is 1/4 inch. And there you go for chopping your onions.
I love that.
You know what? I wish I had that when I was working on Cookie Love with Mindy Siegel, because rolling out dough, if I had just 4 quarters just always sitting there, I would have still gotten out the ruler because I wouldn't have trusted it. But
I'm going to start saving coins now, you guys. I know, we pay with credit cards, but I'm looking for my 4 quarters.
Thank you, Naomi.
And then anyone reading any cookbooks right now, any cookbooks that are sparking your interest?
Well, I keep going back to Mr. Jiu's Chinese cookbook by Brandon Jiu and Tianlan Ho. And it's such an incredible work on Chinese American food and in America, as well as, just the history of Chinese people. So much of it is chefy, but, at the same time, I'm learning so many things from it, little techniques. He's got this thing with mung bean jelly. I know it sounds weird, but it's just this jiggly jelly that you can put like chili oil on it and all this spicy stuff that I've had it in Asia, I've had in New York, and it's sort of hard to come by. And so I'm going to make it. And I find little gems in there all over the place with Brandon's work.
That's so great. We'll put both books that we've mentioned in the show notes so people can check them out. Those are really great. And also, I think it's a sign of ways to use chef cookbooks to further your own culinary education. Sometimes I think we look at chef cookbooks and we're like, they seem like so much work. But in those books, they're not always so much work. And B, you get these gems that you're not going to find in other places. So there's room in the world for lots of different types of books, in other words. And on that note, thanks so much, everyone, for joining on our first inaugural episode of Everything Cookbooks. If you have a burning cookbook question that you just need to get answered, hit us up at Everything Cookbooks on Instagram. Send us a DM there, or you can send us a message. Our website is everythingcookbooks.com. And we can't wait to hear from you. On that note, I'm going to sign off. This is Kate Leahy,
Kristin Donnelly,
Andrea Nguyen,
Molly Stevens.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have a question or a comment, ping us on Instagram. We can be found at Everything Cookbooks, or send us a message at our website, which is everythingcookbooks.com. If you have a few seconds to spare, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It will help others find the show. Much gratitude goes out to our editor, Abigail Cirquitella. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next time.